Well, the time is now 23:36 here in Dublin, in Ireland. It's a cold November evening. We're just about to come to the end of the 4th of November 2020. And we're witnessing the ever unfolding saga of the current 2020 US presidential election. Many people are missing the bigger picture here. Our mainstream media here in Ireland misses the bigger picture deliberately, on purpose, and as a matter of policy. It is also worth bearing in mind that this is a presidential election that's taking place in a foreign country. And too often, possibly because we all speak English, too often there are these armchair pundits who arrogate it upon themselves to patronise the US people and say what they should be voting for and how they should be conducting themselves and all the rest of it. But the reality is that what's happening in the United States at the moment is relevant. It's relevant internationally. It's relevant, of course, to the United States. And it's not being particularly analysed yet for what it really seems to be. Last night I was watching, or early this morning, in the wee hours of this morning, kind of around 3 in the morning here, I was following the US presidential election. And there was a turnaround later in the morning here, it was morning here, it was evening in the United States, in which it became apparent that Donald Trump was indeed going to win. And this is apparent not just from the fact that he picked up all of those swing states that were so necessary. He picked up Florida, he picked up Ohio, he picked up Texas. It's not even that. It's that one of the observations that I made watching Fox News and using about 2 or 3 other sources was that the votes that were coming in from various counties and various parts of states like Wisconsin and Michigan, particularly Pennsylvania, were clearly indicating that Trump was on course to comfortably win those states. Then, this evening in Dublin, at about 8 p.m, 2000 hours here in Dublin, I went to the gym. Now, okay, we're on a lockdown, but there's a gym here in our home. So I went to the gym, and I came back after about an hour and 5 minutes, and in that period then, all of a sudden, Biden appears to have got all of those electoral college votes that he so conveniently needs to get the presidency. That, on the face of it, is questionable. There are many other more prosaic ways one could put it, but it is sufficient to say from a restrained point of view that on the face of it is questionable. That there was such a sudden turnaround so conveniently but so late in the event is questionable. Donald Trump always said that the Democrats would try and steal the election from him. Fintan O'Toole, in the Irish Times, he used to be a credible journalist, but Fintan O'Toole in the Irish Times is saying that Donald Trump is attempting to stage a coup. I think somebody is attempting to stage a coup. I don't think it's Donald Trump. And we're now witnessing a much more, on the one hand, sober tone on social media, even among people who are opponents of Trump. And on the other hand, we're witnessing this type of craziness from people like Fintan O'Toole and all of these other ones. But that's not what the big picture here really is. It would be easy to say that the Democrats have now moved in at the last minute to try and steal the election from Trump. There's much to that. I'm not saying that definitely, but I'm saying it probably. And the question is, you'd be saying to yourself, don't you think they could have done a better job of it? To suddenly discover all of these votes at the last minute that suddenly buck all the trends in these particular states and that go against everything we've been observing. Even Styx Hexenhammer, who's he's pro-Trump, I'm pro-Trump, but you know, like so many of the rational pro-Trump people, we are rational, we're balanced. If we thought it was a bad night for Trump, we'd say it. We wouldn't have responded with that group hysteria that the Clinton supporters came out with 4 years ago. Stick, Sex and Hammer earlier today at about 9 a.m. Ireland time was saying that Trump should move to the Supreme Court and get the vote ended. Yes, that would have been a legitimate move on the part of Trump, to go to the Supreme Court and get the vote ended. Because what's happening now is that this is drifting into the territory of illegitimacy and drifting into the territory of, irrespective of how this ends up and whoever becomes president in January of 2021, and I still predict it'll be Trump, believe it or not. But whether or not the Democrats are able to get Biden in, it's difficult to refute the argument that they're doing this quite simply to undermine Trump. So whether he wins or not, they want to make sure that Trump's final 4 years in the White House are as difficult as possible. Now, there's no better man than Trump. Trump is rising to this. His response to the whole situation has been entirely correct, and he's done something that any lawyer would advise a person to do. He has claimed his victory. Now, in the eyes of strict interpretation of the law, that has little, if any, substance. But in the eyes of the public and in the eyes of general legitimacy, it's exceptionally important. He has not gone graciously into the dark night on this one, and he has absolutely no intention of doing so, and he is absolutely right. But it still doesn't answer the issue of why the Democrats are so crass about what they're doing. If they had wanted to rig this election, well, I mean, there's been a lot of, at the very least, circumstantial evidence of them doing that. Donald Trump, indeed, was asked, as he was stepping on a plane, as he was stepping on Air Force One, he was asked, what do you think of Joe Biden? And he said, Joe Biden's a criminal, and you're a criminal too, he said to the journalist. He said, because you're not reporting the truth about Biden. He's a criminal, and you're a criminal too. And that's difficult to refute. But I still haven't answered the issue of why the Democrats have done this as crassly as they have. And even among those rational people who are not pro-Trump, and it's interesting to see the people who are irrational, like Irish Times journalists, for example, and all the people in RTE, people are disturbed at what they're witnessing. They are disturbed at this. They are disturbed at what appears to be a blatant effort in the last roar of the count to steal away what appeared even 4 hours ago or less. It's now 1:45 here in Dublin. 9 p.m. tonight or 8 p.m. tonight here in Dublin. It seemed like it was all Trump would win. He wouldn't win a huge amount, but that he would get enough to qualify in the Electoral College. So in the past 4 hours, that has all changed. And again, we're not answering why this has happened and why it has happened the way it has. It's important to remember that this is deliberate. Something similar, and this is why this is relevant to us outside of the United States, something similar happened in Ireland this year. We had a general election this year in Ireland, early February of this year. And what happened was, after that general election, it became very clear very quickly that the two major opposing parties would come together to continue the policies of government that have caused so much hurt over the past really 10 years here, and that there would be no change. So instead we ended up with a coalition government of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens, and all that they have done is made things worse. So far from changing the misery that they were inflicting upon people here, and I'm not even referring to the lockdown or COVID-19, there are other policies which so many people wanted to see the back of. Their other policies are now being doubled down on. So they're using the legitimacy of the fact that they won a certain amount of seats in the February election to basically thwart and flout the will of the Irish people. That was deliberate. And what's happening in America is exactly the same thing. This is deliberate. The message that is being sent over to the voters both in the United States and earlier this year in Ireland is a clear and unambiguous one. The message is that your vote does not count. Psychopaths do these things crassly and openly so as to bewilder and to demoralise those who they are abusing. That happened in Ireland this year. It's now happening in America. Another thing that we're seeing in Ireland, I won't comment so clearly about the US mainstream media. I'm not all that qualified to comment, but I am very highly qualified to comment on the Irish mainstream media, is that they're telling lies. And they're doing this in a number of specific ways. The first way they're telling lies is telling lies. But secondly, by not telling people the truth, not telling people the whole story of what's going on. And thirdly, more crassly, I suppose, they are reciting anything that they are told by the government. And that's deliberate again. It's about bewildering. It's about the psychopathic trick of baffling their victims. Those of us who know how psychopaths work, those of us who have years of experience of how psychopaths work, are not baffled and are not bewildered. Furthermore, we're not demoralised. Trump is not demoralised. He's going in guns blazing to this, and he knows he has to. So for Fintan O'Toole to come out with his usual propaganda rubbish to say Donald Trump is attempting a coup is himself black propaganda. Donald Trump has to fight for his position. You would not expect him to do anything less. And the Democrats, and what appears based upon Trump's narrative and the narrative of many other people, the Democrats' 11th hour attempt now to turn this vote around. That's deliberate. That's deliberate. And the lack of credibility of so many of these votes, because there are very, very many reliable reports coming in and have been coming in before the election and before the vote in America of crass, blatant voter fraud. That's deliberate. It is to send a clear message to the US voters, particularly in those very, very important swing states, to send a message to them. Your vote doesn't count. Don't question the system. We're going to just do what we want here. They were caught off guard in 2016 because they didn't expect Trump to win. Right to the very end, they didn't expect Trump to win. They were ready this time. They were ready this time. And it's important, of course, not to panic. It's important, of course, not to reside in fear. It's important, of course, not to become demoralised, because when you become fearful and demoralised, then you make stupid decisions. But it is important to remember that every single one of us, whether it's the Republic of Ireland or whether it's the United States of America, every one of us counts in this. They're trying to get across the message that it doesn't, but that's a false message. We all count in this. Trump counts in this. And people are empathising with Trump. What they're seeing is that he is having a legal right of his stolen from him. Yes, indeed he is. He's not the first person in the world to have that happen to, but in fact, what is happening is actually legitimising Trump all the more. And you won't hear that on RTE. Many of the people who voted for Trump, and much of Trump's constituency, is from people who have been alienated and demoralised and who feel that they don't belong. Many of those were the people who Hillary Clinton so crassly described as the deplorables. Many of them are poor, not well educated. They live in flyover states. They live in rural parts. And the message that the likes of Clinton and the likes of the mainstream media are trying to get over to them is that they don't count, that they don't matter. But my goodness, they do matter. And that's the message that's also trying to be sent here in Ireland, that you don't matter. It's interesting to look at the commentary on Twitter from a lot of Irish males who have responded to what's unfolding in the US with a degree of erudition and I'm not talking about Fintan O'Toole. Fintan O'Toole writes well. But I'm talking about ordinary guys tweeting and kind of pseudo journalists or kind of independent people who might have quite a big following. But what they all have in common is that the intellectual standard of what they're coming out with would embarrass a 3-year-old. That's not a joke. The actual substance, or an exaggeration, the substance in what they're saying is appallingly and embarrassingly primitive. That is because at some level an awful lot of people, whether you like Trump or not, are realising that what's going on here is crooked. And rather than saying it, that this is crooked, or at least potentially crooked, or at least questionable on the face of it, they are resorting to stupid, smug remarks. You will never, ever, ever change them. They are not worth thinking about. They are not worth even the emotional energy. But those who in Ireland would have been opposed to Trump are either resorting to being silent or are coming out with exceptionally, as I already described, infantile remarks. Certainly, there is no sense of legitimate triumph or even genuine gladness that Biden might win, and I still don't think he will. This is significant. Of course, these people were tweeting, these men in their 30s and 40s and early 50s from posher parts of Dublin. They wouldn't have in any way thought about this. But the fact is that maybe at some subliminal level they're aware that this is wrong. And I draw a contrast with the 2000 election between Bush and Gore, in which ultimately it ended up in the Supreme Court and Gore lost. The other votes in the other states that both Gore and Bush did get, there was very little, if anything, to suggest illegitimacy to them. But that was a knife-edge election. That was a very, very close election. Indeed, 2004 between Bush and John Kerry was a very knife-edge election in the US. But this is different now. This is a lot different. And this matters, and this is worth watching closely, while at the same time not allowing oneself to panic or become consumed with fear. And I say this to anybody listening in America as well, in the US. Don't become frightened. Don't become depressed. Don't become bewildered. Stand back and watch. And come online and tweet and post comments on Facebook or wherever. Join the conversation. But don't allow this to demoralise you, because that is what they want. That is what they want. They want you to become demoralised. They want you to become fearful. Because then when you become demoralised and fearful, you start being irrational. Don't go out to protests too much. Although Americans, I'm not telling Americans what to do. I suppose I'm saying it in an Irish context. Get out there and make sure that you're watching what's going on, which is a different thing from protesting. Going and looking at election counts, going and looking at ballot centres, nothing wrong with that. That's not protest. That's your right as citizens, indeed, possibly almost your patriotic duty. But this is not a time for rioting. This is not a time for screaming and shouting. This is a time for people to have very calm heads and watch what's going on. Trump tweets in hyperbole, of course, Trump being Trump. But at the same time, he's not going to lose his rocker over this. He's going to make sure that this is done properly, and that any challenges and any demands for recounts and anything that ends up in the Supreme Courts, either of the individual states or ultimately the US Supreme Court, he's going to make sure that the best lawyers deal with this the best way. He's right to do that. He has no other option. So when you have these journalists baffling you and bewildering you, the way Fintan O'Toole is, Fintan O'Toole said, Donald Trump has attempted to stage a coup. That's rubbish. This is why subscriptions to the Irish Times are, nosediving. Donald Trump wants to protect his interests here. He was a businessman. He was good at that kind of thing. And it's unrealistic for him to expect to do anything else. So the thing to do now for all of us is let Trump and his lawyers handle this. Continue to support him, continue to retweet his messages, continue to express your support and solidarity with Trump. And always remember that this is actually a delicious moment in its own way, because he's proven right. In 2016, people called him a conspiracy theorist. Well, one can be a conspiracy theorist, but sometimes one can also tend to be right.